Lies of P began for me in the shadow of FromSoft, and even after playing it, it's impossible for me to think about it outside the context of originality. Because yes, it borrows heavily from the FromSoft formula, and yes, there are certainly soulslikes out there that have done more to set themselves apart. But to be fair, that FromSoft formula has proven itself to be pretty flexible time and time again. In my eyes, Lies of P makes full use of that flexibility to deliver something that's simultaneously faithful and innovative, more homage than ripoff. I found its unique identity in how it remixes combat into an intuitive balance of offense and defense-oriented mechanics, how it respects its fairy tale source material while reimagining it in the gritty style the genre calls for, and how it brings its compelling world and characters to life in the fully realized city of Krat. These achievements are unique to Lies of P, and although it wears its influences on its sleeve with absolute transparency, it does more than enough to earn its identity, making for a great entry into the Souls-like genre. Like I said, I was a bit skeptical going into Lies of P. I was afraid of finding an unnecessarily dark story that doesn't have the substance to justify its tone, depending on the novelty of it being a gritty retelling of a children's fairy tale. Instead, I found that Lies of P has genuine heart at its core. It cares for its characters, and although its world contains suffering and tragedy on an enormous scale, it accompanies those traits with optimism and warmth. Obscured undercurrents though they may be, I never got the sense that the game felt cynically toward the future of Krat. It treads a fine line between its two sides, and I think it does it well, earning its dark tone without deviating into gratuitousness. Lies of P begins in the aftermath of two citywide calamities: the puppet frenzy, which is the spontaneous and mysterious transformation of almost every puppet in Krat, from autonomous servants and laborers to killing machines, and the petrification disease, the epidemic that turns its victims to stone. As Pinocchio, your job is to fight your way through the many hostile regions of the city of Krat to uncover the mystery of its demise and ultimately to save it. On a character level, Lies of P is about Pinocchio and Geppetto's relationship, taking the novel's themes about honesty and building upon them, introducing gray morality where the novel had black and white. Most notably, lying is an often empathetic ability that showcases the story's themes about what it means to be human. Pinocchio becomes less puppet-like when he chooses to spare someone the pain of the truth, for instance. Chooses is the key word here. The point isn't simply that lying is the right thing to do, but rather that Pinocchio differentiates himself from other puppets with his ability to make the choice at all. In other words, the context of the lie matters. That being said, I didn't like that those moments of choice seemed to favor lying, as I didn't get the sense that it was what the story was trying to say. Regardless, I enjoyed how the Pinocchio-Geppetto dynamic played with this departure from the source material, subverting both characters and themes from the novel. The relationship between Pinocchio and Geppetto elegantly reconciles the fairy tale with the Souls-like genre. The Blue Fairy is reimagined here as Sophia, Pinocchio's guide through both Krat and self-identification. Unlike the novel, she isn't so much a mother figure as she is a supplicant. She needs Pinocchio's help to save the city of Krat as much as he needs hers. Her reinterpretation retains the warmth from the source material while understating it, making it fit her role as the genre's archetypal upgrade lady. She's much more than that though. She's integral to the plot and as important to Pinocchio's journey as Geppetto. Sophia was a sympathetic character in an overwhelmingly hostile world, providing an opportunity to become emotionally invested as well as giving a face to Krat. She also held a compelling mystery that stayed true to the spirit of the novel while tying tightly into the game's lore. It was legitimately cool to see how Lies of P molded characters like the Blue Fairy to fit its grim aesthetic. Considering just how much I enjoyed these versions of Geppetto and Sophia, I was disappointed to find that the minor side characters were very inconsistent. On the one hand, I really liked Eugenie, the weaponsmith, whose story about getting separated from her family during their immigration is personal and moving. I was emotionally invested. She gave me a tangible sense of what Pinocchio is actually fighting for. She also contributes to the lore by hinting at a world outside of Krat. On the other hand, you have Lorenzini Vanini, the inventor, whose backstory feigns depth by pairing his big personality with a tragic past. His only personality traits are, 1, that underneath his narcissistic exterior, he really does care, and 2, that he has an Italian accent. He's little more than a caricature whose personality clashes with the game's tone, and although I'm definitely in favor of genre trope subversion, I didn't think it was justified given how one-dimensional he is. At its best, the optional content gave me characters to connect to, and mini-arcs that tied nicely into the themes of the main plot. At its worst, it had me engaging with boring characters. It was easily the game's weakest point for me. The art design throughout is stellar, borrowing from the FromSoft aesthetic to form a foundation for its own visual identity. Despite the opening region being heavily inspired by Bloodborne, with its grimy cobblestone streets and dilapidated cars and buildings, the world of Lies of P expands far beyond that, into dark caves, an eerie church, a technological exhibition, disgusting swamps, a majestic manor, and various other locations. Each has its own direction that retains cohesion across the map and is highly specific to this world and its lore, like the swamp where broken puppets are dumped, or this exhibition where advances in puppet technology are on display. Time and weather change after boss fights, with the new lighting and color temperatures always flattering the environment, ensuring that the great art design isn't kneecapped by any technical factors. Character designs were also a highlight, from the polished look of Hotel Krat's butler, Polendina, that differentiates him from the deranged aesthetic of enemy puppets, to the way the personality comes through in the designs of Vanini and Sophia, to how the animal characters from the fairy tale are reimagined as stalkers. Weapons all look great and are unique to this world. This axe, for example, has puppet arms built into it. I'll talk about enemy designs later in this video, but suffice to say that every element contributed to the game's unique visual identity. The levels in Lies of P are visually communicative, which compelled me to investigate their mysteries without feeling like it was fighting me with overly confusing layouts. Although it's essentially linear, exploration comes by way of dead-end offshoots and shortcuts that reward the player without detracting from the plot's momentum. I'd often see the entrance to a shortcut before I could access it, so that I knew what to look for as I progressed through a region. Even at its most labyrinthine, it gave me some sort of objective to move towards. The offshoots sometimes culminated in a mid-level enemy that would reward me with particularly rare and worthwhile loot, like quartz or a legion plug. Loading screens are few and far between, meaning that most of the time I saw exactly how one place led to another. I would often look into the horizon from a cliff and see familiar landmarks, like Hotel Krat or the church. I got the satisfaction of seeing my progress laid before me while keeping the path ahead obscured. More than once I had that aha moment that Souls-likes conjure, when I'd unexpectedly completed a loop and ended up where I'd begun. Lies of P does a great job of making this feel like one big, interconnected world that rewards exploration and made me feel deeply immersed. Lies of P's combat unabashedly borrows from FromSoft's formula with a combination of faithfulness and innovation that demonstrates a profound understanding of what makes Souls-like so engaging. A few mechanics in particular stood out to me for how they remixed familiar ideas, introduced new ones, and kept that great core feel of the game's influences. For example, blocking reduces damage but doesn't negate it altogether. Instead, a mechanic called Guard Regain lets you get back some of your lost health by attacking soon after. That health is lost permanently if you wait too long, so the player is encouraged to behave aggressively. This game's healing item, the Pulse Cell, also promotes offense by regenerating as you deal damage once your supply has been exhausted. I can't tell you how many times I was close to death in the middle of a boss fight, thinking I stood no chance, and powered through after realizing I was so close to earning a single Pulse Cell. That risk and reward keeps the game difficult, but still finds ways to reward the player for engaging with its many systems. On the other hand, Perfect Guard encourages deliberate defensive behavior. There's a short window of time just before an enemy's attack lands, during which you can block and take no damage at all, as well as a much reduced hit to your stamina. This isn't passive defense though, since it takes time to become familiar with the game's many enemies, but rather thoughtful and considered defense. When I used these mechanics in their totality, they synergized into a well-balanced and fun combat system. There's a wide range of weapon choices that vary in weight, damage type, and duration of animation, which open the game up to different playstyles. However, I thought the weapon's mix and match system was the highlight, which allowed me to pair the hilt of one weapon with the blade of another. I generally prioritize base weapon damage, but since those stronger weapons were typically big and heavy, I had to deal with long attack animations that left me vulnerable. I got around that by taking the blade of a powerful weapon and combining it with the hilt of a smaller, faster one, resulting in the best of both worlds. I got the high attack damage and a lower attack duration. But that's just one possible benefit. With so many stats and damage types, the system's open to many different approaches. I imagine someone could put together parts in a way that maximizes fire damage, for instance, which is particularly effective against ergo monsters. It's a great example of how Lies of P builds upon the genre's fundamentals to offer a uniquely customizable experience. Supplementing your primary weapon is the Legion Arm, which I was able to switch out throughout my playthrough according to which I thought would help me out most in any given scenario. There are several options, though I mainly use 3. Falconize is essentially a rocket launcher, and although it didn't actually cause high damage, I used it frequently because it cut enemy health regeneration short, particularly useful in boss fights. Aegis is a shield that knocked enemies off balance just by blocking, saving me the precious couple of seconds it would take me to charge a dedicated heavy attack. Fulminous was a convenient way to apply electricity to puppet enemies who are vulnerable to that damage type. To keep them from being OP though, the arm is tied to a finite meter that allows only a few uses per run, though there's an item you can use to recharge it. The Legion Arm supports the rest of the combat model by enabling another layer of player choice and strategy, making it that much more engaging. Lies of P's enemies encouraged me to fully engage with the combat mechanics. Within the already expansive range of enemy types, there's an even bigger array of attacks that change up the cadence and feel of fights, keeping things from getting monotonous. There are slams, swipes, grabs, dives, jabs, swings, shots, throws, and area of effect attacks, all with different windups, knockback, damage, and successive attacks. With so much variety, each enemy type made for a unique encounter. I had to think about how best to approach every fight. Things get even more interesting when you take into account enemy placement, since multiple enemy types can synergize and make for a special challenge. For example, an uphill street had me fighting through several puppets with flamethrowers. Since they could do a lot of damage at close range, I had to rush in and kill them before either started firing, while simultaneously dodging the bombs from the puppets if I got too close to them. Just as importantly, I had to stay aware of how far up the street I was, so I wouldn't be surprised by the big clown puppet at the other end. Perfect guard came in handy once I got to him, since it would make him vulnerable to being staggered. Combat shined the brightest when all of these different parts, level design, enemy types, enemy placement, reinforced each other. The enemy's personality comes through in their movesets and animations as much as their character design. For instance, there are these carnivalesque puppets that flamboyantly present their bomb to you before spinning around and throwing it, and this huge round puppet that hops around and projects a comically large fist at you, highlighting its size with all of its movements and attacks. These doll-like puppets have an uncanny valley effect straight out of a horror movie, so their animations are appropriately creepy, moving in fits and starts. In terms of non-puppets, these alchemist enemies move with a self-important stiffness that matches the tone of their occult organization. Every enemy was not only compelling in combat, but also interesting to look at, contributing to the game's world building and tone. Boss fights have all those same strengths, but push the player even further to take advantage of every mechanic at their disposal. For instance, I found the stagger system essential, which let me knock enemies off balance with a charged attack after dealing enough damage, after which they'd become vulnerable to a particularly powerful blow. It also gave me some breathing room to use consumables, which was necessary more often than not. It lent a certain rhythm to boss fights for me. Each stagger would be a triumph, signaling that I was one step closer to victory. Perfect Guard could also open them up to being staggered, so I was encouraged to become familiar with their moveset in order to make use of that too. Another example, if a boss constantly kept me at a distance in order to regenerate health, I'd plan ahead and equip the rocket launcher Legion arm, which interrupted regeneration. I'd also choose amulet loadouts specifically to counteract one boss's strengths and exploit their weaknesses, like equipping an amulet that increases damage against humans when I'm fighting a human boss. Even more than with regular enemies, I had to think about every little thing I could do to turn the tide. The synergy of bosses' movesets made for some really memorable encounters. One of the early bosses, the King's Flame, shoots gobs of oil around the room before projecting fireballs at you, and even if they miss, they have a chance of hitting the oil and blowing it up, which will hurt you if you're too close. That's just one example, but it shows how just a couple of moves combine to create a new challenge entirely, forcing the player to be spatially aware since the environment becomes as dangerous as the boss. There are plenty of others. The Black Rabbit Brotherhood, which has you fighting multiple enemies at once, each with their own cadence that you need to learn, from the slow but powerful attacks of one to the ranged attacks of another. There's also the Walker of Illusions, which will spawn a clone of itself. Since the clone had much less health, I'd usually try to get rid of it before moving on to the original, but there were several times that the original would use an area of effect attack just as I was about to deal the killing blow, knocking me off my feet and keeping the clone in the fight. Each of these examples presents a different challenge, but they all worked for me because they made encounters even more interesting by combining moves to create entirely new threats. The combat of Lies of P does everything I could hope for in a Souls-like. Solid fundamentals that balance mastery, strategy, and upgrades, and interesting enemies that encouraged me to step out of my comfort zone and engage with all of the tools at my disposal. It didn't make me farm for Ergo, my least favorite trope of the genre, but it wasn't too easy either. Its innovations are smart and well implemented, making the game its own. Any flaws I came across were incredibly minor compared to its achievements, and I really can't overstate how much I enjoyed every minute of it. Performance was great. I have very little to complain about. I played Lies of P on a laptop running an AMD 6800M graphics card. At 1440p and the highest settings, the game comfortably averaged about 120 frames per second. There was some variance, sometimes dipping into the 90s, but it wasn't perceptible to my eyes. Outdoor areas had some micro-stuttering, but that wasn't enough to affect my experience either. On extremely rare occasions, I got heavy stuttering, but it happened so infrequently that it didn't result in any frustrating combat moments. I don't think I noticed any bugs whatsoever throughout my entire playthrough, and although that doesn't mean no bugs exist at all, I still think it's a huge achievement. Graphics were great, with highly detailed textures almost everywhere, though I noticed a lot of low-res walls in the game's last area. Hair, in particular, looked really good on all characters, especially on Pinocchio himself. The textures looked nice and moved naturally according to his own movement. A few assets, like mortar shells, looked mediocre, but when I can count the number of models I disliked on one hand, I know I'm being nitpicky. The overwhelming majority of textures were both beautifully designed and technically sound, so I really don't have much to criticize here. Animations from all enemies and player character actions looked great, with particle effects that were flashy but never so busy as to be overwhelming. Overall, some really great work here, with very tiny issues that almost feel not worth mentioning at all. Does Lies of P need to have the degree of innovation and originality of its inspirations to be great? I don't think so. It demonstrates profound insight on behalf of the developers into what makes a Souls-like tick. It keeps the core greatness of a FromSoft game, from combat to world building to visual aesthetic to level design, and iterates on it to establish its own identity. And it tells a compelling story in an endlessly interesting world that balances the optimism of its source material with the grittiness that the genre calls for. The sequel tease at the end is very exciting, and I for one will have my ears open for any news, because I think Lies of P is nothing short of a masterwork. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, and if you want more like this, subscribe and ring the bell. I'm working on my Spider-Man 2 review, so you can expect that soon. Thanks so much for watching.